A Bible printed in 1666 was found at the center of a murder scene in 1890, bound in worn calfskin, pages brittle with age, and one chapter conspicuously missing. The victim, Father Elias Rook, was discovered kneeling in the nave of St. Josiah's Chapel, mouth sewn shut with rosary wire, eyes gouged clean from their sockets and replaced with consecrated wafers. The blood had dried in perfect circles around him, 12 in all, like halos drawn by a hand that knew scripture better than sanity. No weapon was found, no footprints. Just the smell of burnt incense, the faint sound of whispering that lingered hours after the body was removed, and that Bible opened precisely to where the lost chapter should have been, as if it had been read one final time. Before we begin, I just want to tell you, this story doesn't end the way you expect. In fact, the ending might stay with you long after the video's over. So don't skip, watch till the very last second. Trust me, it's not just the middle that matters, it's the silence at the end. Now let's begin to story. The snow had begun falling sometime before midnight, thick and soundless, smoothing over the edges of everything in that quiet valley where the pine trees closed in like watchers. The body was found just after dawn, slumped against the stone wall of St. Josiah's Chapel, half covered in white, the mouth frozen open in a final breath that never escaped. His name was Elias Finch, and he'd been the caretaker of the chapel for nearly 30 years. Widower, no children, mostly kept to himself. People said he spoke too softly for a man with hands that thick, but the townsfolk in Renthorpe rarely said much at all unless it was whispered in pews or murmured over gravestones. The kind of town that seemed stillborn in time, forgotten by the railroads and the world alike. Sheriff Cotter was the one who found the Bible, a mottled thing, more leather than paper now, its cover warped and blistered like old skin, bearing the year 1666 stamped in cracked gold foil. It hadn't been in the chapel. It had been laid open in the snow next to the corpse, pages stiff as bark, one side saturated with blood that had turned to a rust-colored plate in the cold. Cotter didn't touch it at first. He only looked at it, that unnaturally old book beside a man whose eyes still hadn't closed. Something about the pairing felt wrong, not grotesque, but orchestrated, as though it hadn't been left there but placed, with thought, with care, almost reverently. Later, when the coroner arrived and they finally brought the Bible in to dry, a whisper went around the station like a draft under a locked door. The book of Revelation was missing. The entire chapter, gone. Not torn. Not cut. Removed. Precisely, cleanly, as if it had never existed. The church, of course, had its stories. They always do. The original St. Josiah's had been burned to its bones in 1775 after a priest was found hanging from the steeple bell with his tongue nailed to a psalm board. No culprit was ever named, though plenty were suspected. The one they built in its place was quieter, more modest, a squat granite thing with no windows in its sacristy and only a single door that locked from the inside with a key as long as a man's palm. Elias had kept that key on a chain around his neck. It was still there when they found him. No signs of forced entry. No footprints in the snow besides his own, and those led from the back of the church to the wall where he died. He'd walked there himself. They checked the grounds, the graveyard, the cellar beneath the chapel where they kept the rusted baptismal font and a few mildewed cassocks. No blood. No drag marks. No weapon. And no one could explain why, in his final hours, Elias had taken the old Bible from the locked reliquary where it had rested for over 100 years, and why he had gone out into the freezing dark with it like a man bringing an offering to something unseen. People talked, naturally. Not loudly, not publicly, but it didn't take long before they started remembering things. Like how Elias had stopped attending the main service and began coming only at dusk, lighting candles long after the nave was empty, kneeling for hours in front of the altar with his back to the crucifix, never facing it. Or how, 2 weeks before he died, he boarded up the confessional booth without explanation, nailing a single piece of birchwood across its open mouth with 6 iron nails, all hand-forged. Some said they saw him talking to himself in Latin. Others said it wasn't Latin at all. Just sounds. Chanting. One woman, Mrs. Haverley, said she heard him humming a tune in the cemetery one night, a lullaby that she swore hadn't been heard since the death of her infant brother in 1947. It was the melody, she told the sheriff. But it was wrong. It dragged. Like it didn't want to be sung. Sheriff Cotter was not a man given to superstition. He'd seen the worst of what people could do to one another when he served out west during the war, and he believed in simple things: greed, anger, jealousy. He believed this, too, would yield to something familiar, something traceable. But the Bible made him uneasy. Especially once the historian arrived. Professor Ellery Dunn came from Boston, sent by a contact at the diocese who had heard of the discovery and recognized the rarity of a 1666 King James Bible, especially one with provenance unknown. Dunn was in his late 60s, carried the air of a man accustomed to dusty libraries and slow movements. When he saw the Bible, he went still for a long time. Then he asked to see it alone. Cotter allowed it, watching through the glass in the evidence room door as the professor knelt beside the table and opened it as one would open a coffin. He didn't turn pages. He studied the margins. The paper. The ink. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "This Bible should not exist," he said simply. "It's not just the age. It's the annotations." He pointed to the margins of the Gospel of Matthew, where a thin, spidery script wound around the printed text in a language Cotter didn't recognize. "That's not English. That's not Latin. I believe it's Enochian." He waited for the sheriff to react. He didn't. The language of angels. Invented, or, depending on your belief, received, by Dr. John Dee in the 1500s. Most consider it occult nonsense. But this predates Dee's recorded vocabulary. Cotter didn't respond. He was watching Dunn's hands, which trembled slightly when he turned the pages toward the end of the Bible, toward where Revelation should have been. The professor let out a thin breath when he reached the final extant page, Jude, verse 25. Then nothing. Just a seam, perfectly straight. The next leaf had been extracted with surgical precision. "I don't think he removed it," Dunn said. "I think he was trying to keep it from being removed." That night, the sheriff didn't go home. He sat in his office, listening to the wind push against the old courthouse walls, the snow ticking against the windowpane like fingernails. He stared at the photograph they had taken of Elias's body. Something about the way he had fallen, almost kneeling, forehead nearly touching the old stone, it reminded him of something. An image, maybe, from childhood catechism. A posture of supplication. Or surrender. At 3:11 a.m., the phone rang. It was Father Merrin, the parish priest. His voice was hushed. "Sheriff. The chapel. You need to come." Cotter didn't ask questions. He drove through the snow with his siren off. The chapel was dark, but the door was open. He stepped inside, expecting the usual creak of hinges, the musty warmth of old incense. But the air was cold, metallic, as if something had been recently unearthed. Father Merrin stood by the altar, his face pale. He didn't speak. He simply pointed. On the altar lay the Bible. Closed. Damp. And beside it, the missing chapter. Not printed. Not torn. Handwritten. In the same ink as the margins. The paper looked flayed, translucent. The sheriff leaned in. The title at the top did not read Revelation. It read, Unbinding. And below it, the first line, still wet. "And they shall make of their worship a door, and of their prayers a key." He looked up. Father Merrin had backed away from the altar, eyes wide, lips moving without sound. There was a sound now, but it wasn't from the chapel. It was from beneath them, under the flagstones. A slow, rhythmic tapping. Not like footsteps. Like breath. As if the earth itself were exhaling. And the candles, the ones no one had lit, began to tremble. Cotter didn't move. Not for several seconds. His hand hovered over the surface of the altar, inches from the parchment that still glistened faintly with ink, though there was no quill, no bottle, no evidence of who or what had written it. The letters themselves seemed to shiver subtly on the page, as if they had weight or warmth, as if they had only just come into being. The script was narrow, unearthly precise, written in straight, unnatural lines, not curved, not looping, but rigid, like something traced through muscle memory rather than intent. The sheriff turned to Father Merrin, whose back was now pressed against the nave wall, rosary clutched in both hands like a lifeline. "What is this?" Cotter asked. Merrin didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the trapdoor behind the altar, the one that led to the subcellar. No one ever used it. Even Elias, as far as anyone knew, had never gone below. The tapping continued. Faint, but consistent. The rhythm had a rising cadence, too deliberate to be an animal. 3 slow taps, then silence. 3 again. It didn't stop. It didn't hurry. Cotter moved toward the trapdoor. "No," Merrin said suddenly, stepping forward, voice sharp with real fear. "Don't go down there. That's not." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Something else had just happened. The air shifted again, subtly, a drop in pressure, like before a storm. And a new sound began, low and winding. It came from inside the chapel now. Not beneath. From the walls. It was singing. Not in any voice Cotter could describe. Not choral. Not human. A threading, dry harmony that seemed to slide across frequencies like radio static slowed to a hymn. The lyrics were impossible, layered, reversed, pulling against each other. But they said one thing, over and over, in a way that bypassed language and buried itself in the body. Let the veil fall. Let the veil fall. Let the veil fall. Cotter's breath caught. He turned in a full circle. No one was there. The door was still open behind him, wind pushing snow against the threshold. Father Merrin was murmuring the Lord's Prayer over and over, each time faster, more frantic, like a man trying to outrun a wave. The sheriff stepped back to the altar, resisting the urge to look at the trapdoor again. The page with the so-called unbinding had begun to curl at the edges now, as if responding to the room. He didn't know why he did it, maybe habit, maybe disbelief, but he reached out and turned the page. The ink was still fresh on the next line. He who guards the gate shall speak backwards and bleed forwards, and no lock shall hold when his name is spoken at depth. Cotter stared. Before he could stop himself, he asked aloud, softly, whose name? The song stopped. And something answered. It wasn't a voice in the normal sense. It was a shape in the sound, a word without form that scraped across the inside of his skull, leaving something raw and flickering behind his eyes. He stumbled back, vision swimming. His heart knocked hard once, then paused, just a moment, then resumed. He tasted copper. Father Merrin collapsed. Not fell, collapsed. As if something inside him gave way. The sheriff rushed over, knelt beside him, but the priest's eyes were open and empty, not dead but emptied, like a bell that had been struck too many times. Then Cotter heard a new sound. The latch on the trapdoor clicked. It hadn't been touched. He turned. The heavy iron loop that had secured it for decades hung loose now, the old wood swelling upward as if under pressure from below. Not violently. Slowly. With weight. Cotter stood. And the first whisper came up from beneath the floor. Not a word. A confession. Spoken in Elias Finch's voice. I saw it written on the inside of her skin. Then another voice. Female. Fragile. We sang to it in the root cellar before the fire. We thought it was God. Then another. A child. It opened its mouth and 100 fingers came out. I touched one. It's still in me. Cotter backed away from the trapdoor, but the floorboards beneath him groaned like something vast was shifting beneath them, not rising, not breaching, but rearranging itself. And the Bible, the book itself, was now shaking. Not trembling. Shaking. Cotter grabbed it, closed it without looking again at the parchment, shoved it under his coat. He took one last look at Father Merrin, who was now smiling, a slack, beatific grin without focus or warmth, and ran out into the snow. He didn't stop until he reached his car. The Bible was burning hot against his chest. Behind him, the chapel door shut on its own. 3 sharp clicks, like a lock. But St. Josiah's hadn't had a working lock in over 40 years. Sheriff Cotter didn't start the engine right away. He sat in the driver's seat, one hand on the key, the other still pressed against the bulge of the Bible beneath his coat, feeling its heat pulse unnaturally, not like something burning, but like something alive. His breath fogged the windshield. Snow kept falling in thick, wet sheets that distorted the shape of the chapel through the glass, made it look like it was sinking, folding inward. The lights on the dashboard flickered when he finally turned the key. Once. Twice. On the third attempt, the engine came to life with a sick churn, as though something in it didn't want to wake. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror as he reversed, not to watch the road, but to keep the chapel in sight. The door remained shut. No lights. No movement. But as he backed away, something shifted in the reflection. Not in the chapel, in the mirror. For a fraction of a second, the image twisted. The snow fell upwards. The walls bent. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. He drove without direction. Past the cemetery. Past the dark outlines of the town. Not toward his house, not anywhere he could name. Just away. The Bible never cooled. He thought about throwing it out the window. Into a ditch. Into the woods. But the idea made his chest tighten with a pressure that felt like grief, or guilt, or something older. He couldn't let go of it. Not yet. At a gas station on the outskirts of Renthorpe, long closed, the pump handles dangling like broken limbs, he finally stopped. The radio came on by itself. Just static. But buried under it, a voice flickered in and out. Repeating the same line. The keys are mouths. The locks are bones. The door is faith. He yanked the dial off its axis and pulled the battery cables loose. Silence. The Bible thumped once in his coat. A single jolt, like a heartbeat. He took it out, held it under the fluorescence buzzing above the car bay. The cover had changed. Not visibly. Not to the eye. But to the hand, to the nerves in his fingers, it was different. Softer. Warmer. No longer leather. Or if it wasn't cowhide. Something finer. Almost porous. It flexed slightly when he gripped it tighter. He set it on the hood of the car and opened it again. The handwritten chapter, the unbinding, had grown. What had been 2 pages was now 4. And he was certain, absolutely certain, that the words hadn't been there before. He would have remembered these. When the faithful no longer pray, the silence is not empty, it is a space, and it waits to be filled. The first voice that speaks into that silence becomes the cornerstone. All things built atop it will echo that voice. Even churches. Cotter wiped his mouth. He tasted rust. Again. A car approached then, sudden and loud, headlights stabbing the dark. He snapped the Bible shut and tucked it back under his coat. It was done, the professor. His car skidded slightly as it stopped. He got out in a hurry, holding something wrapped in a white cloth. I went back to the reliquary, he said without preamble, breath visible in the cold. There's something else. It was under the velvet liner. Hidden. He unwrapped it slowly. It was a handbell. Old, tarnished, ornate. But instead of a clapper, there was something else suspended inside. A loop of knotted hair, still black, matted, tied through with a sliver of bone. Cotter just stared. Why? Dunn didn't answer immediately. He was watching the sheriff's chest. You have it on you, don't you? Cotter nodded. I think that bell is how they used it. How they opened it. What do you mean, used it? Dunn glanced around, lowered his voice. That chapel was built on something. Not just physically. Liturgically. It's not just the Bible. That building is a frame. A structure meant to contain a very specific kind of silence. Like insulation. I think Elias knew it. I think he was keeping it quiet. Until he wasn't, Cotter said. The professor nodded slowly. Until he tried to lock it permanently. And failed. From behind them, the snow shifted. Not drifted. Shifted, as if something underneath had moved. A low sound followed. Not a growl. Not wind. A syllable. Drawn out. Cotter turned. There was nothing but white. Dunn said, very softly, they're not coming out of the chapel, Sheriff. They're coming out of the people who went in. Cotter took a breath. It felt wrong going into his lungs. He opened the Bible again. The 5th page was blank. He watched as the ink began to rise. Slowly. From within the page. Writing itself. No pen. No hand. No hesitation. And behold, the custodian carried the mouth of God against his breast, and each breath he took fed the door, and the door was pleased. Cotter snapped the book shut and looked at Dunn. It's writing me. Dunn didn't flinch. Then it's already open. The wind changed. It didn't pick up, it altered, as if the space around them exhaled something not meant for air. Cotter didn't say another word. He walked around the hood of the car and placed the Bible on the concrete beneath the broken pump lights, suddenly afraid to keep it pressed against him for another second. The moment it left his hands, the cold hit his chest like a rebuke. Like something had been shielding him from more than just the weather. Dunn approached slowly, his eyes fixed not on the book but on the patch of pavement it sat on, as though expecting it to spread. Don't touch it again, he said. It's marked you. Cotter looked up sharply. What the hell does that mean? Dunn licked his lips, hesitated, then finally said, Do you remember the church ledger? Cotter nodded. There's a gap in it, Dunn said. Between 1874 and 1890. Pages missing. Torn out clean. Someone didn't want anyone to know what went on during those years. But I found a copy of an older burial record from the diocesan archives back in Boston. There were 19 deaths tied to St. Josiah's in that span. All sudden. All unexplained. All with bleeding from the ears and mouths. Most with evidence of self-inflicted injury, clawing, biting, even attempts to tear out their own tongues. Cotter looked at him in disbelief, and no one stopped it. Someone tried. That's when the reliquary was sealed. When the Bible was locked away, he gestured toward the bell in his hands. And this was buried with the last of them. A deacon named Harold Bishop. He was the one who wrote the annotations, Sheriff. The Enochian margins. He believed he could write what had been spoken. Like a reversal. An undoing. Cotter looked down at the Bible, but it didn't work. No, Dunn whispered. Because it was never spoken. Not in full. Until now, behind them, the air snapped. A sound like timber splitting deep in the earth. They both turned. In the darkness, far down the road, the outline of the chapel had changed. The steeple was taller, just barely, but unmistakably taller, as if a new segment had grown from its peak. No lights inside, just the rising shape, wrung against the sky, sharp and unfinished, as though continuing to build itself, slowly, like a plant reaching. The bell in Dunn's hands began to hum. A low, metallic vibration that rattled the bone shard against the tangled hair. "I think it's calling," Dunn said. His voice was shaking. "Not people, things that remember being people." Cotter stepped back from the Bible. His instinct told him to run, to drive. But run where? The words were still writing themselves beneath that cover. It would follow. The sheriff drew his revolver without thinking. He wasn't even sure when his hand had gone to it. He raised it. Dunn held up his hands. "You can't shoot a prayer, Cotter." The sheriff's hand trembled. "I'm not aiming at the prayer." But he didn't fire. Instead, they both turned sharply when a figure stepped into the edge of the light. It was a woman. Middle-aged. Her coat was soaked through, her eyes glassy. She was barefoot. Her feet bled into the snow. She held nothing, said nothing, just looked at them both. Dunn took a step forward. Are you all right?" She opened her mouth. At first, no sound came. Then, "You left it outside the house of God." Cotter took a step back. "What did you say?" The woman blinked slowly, as if trying to wake up. Then her voice dropped, deeper, scraped with ruin. "He bled for years in that place. He fed the stone. And you let it open." She stepped closer. Her hands were beginning to rise. Something moved beneath her skin. Small ripples, like insects trapped in flesh. Cotter raised his weapon. "Don't come closer." She didn't stop. Her eyes were pitched now, wet and endless. Then she spoke a name. It wasn't a name Cotter recognized. But he knew, somehow, it was his. Not the one he had been given. Not the one he used. But the first one. The name below memory. And it struck him like a hand against the chest. His knees buckled. He dropped the revolver. Beside him, the Bible snapped open. Pages flew wildly as if caught in a wind that did not exist, flapping, blurring. Then they stopped. One word written across a blank page in wide, black strokes. "Enter." The woman smiled. And from far down the road, from the direction of the chapel, the bell in the steeple began to toll. But St. Josiah's had no bell. Not anymore. The tolling did not echo like a normal bell, it didn't roll or fade. It hung, impossibly sustained, like a wound that refused to clot. Cotter stood only because Dunn grabbed his arm, steadied him. But the sheriff wasn't really in his body anymore. Something had split. Something had remembered. The name, that name she'd spoken, it wasn't just ancient. It was his, yes, but not from birth, from before. A name tied to some moment he'd never lived, yet felt at the edge of every nightmare he'd never recalled upon waking. The barefoot woman dropped to her knees then, hands splayed, mouth open in an expression not of grief but of relief, as if a decades-long burden had lifted the moment Cotter had heard that name. Behind her, more figures appeared, one by one, stepping from the dark woods bordering the old gas station lot. Men, women, children, all in silence, some with clothes from another century, some with no eyes. One held a severed crucifix. Another, a lantern with no flame. They gathered without fear, without noise. They came not for violence, but for fulfillment. Dunn backed away slowly, the bell still in his hands. The hair loop writhed. The bone fragment was cracking along invisible lines, as if reacting to the air. "It's begun," he whispered. The cycle's re-engaged. The book, it's not just a witness. It's a keystone. Cotter looked down at it. The pages had stopped fluttering. A new chapter had etched itself, elegant and final. The door stands within the custodian. His breath sanctifies it. His death completes it. He knew then, knew it with that quiet, inescapable knowledge that seeps in like light beneath a locked door. It had never been about the murders in 1890. Not really. They were symptoms. The Bible had passed through those hands, yes. But each time, it had rewritten itself. Federation waited. It had been growing a chapter, not revealing one. And now it had what it needed, a bearer, marked, named, remembered. "I need to go back," Cotter said softly. His voice was not a voice anymore. It had a second tone buried beneath it, like another man speaking in reverse. Dunn heard it too, and something behind his eyes shattered. But he didn't stop Cotter. He just nodded, tears caught in his beard, knowing. The sheriff turned to the figures. They parted without command, forming a path. Snow hissed as it melted beneath his boots. By the time he reached the road, the chapel had fully transformed. The steeple was spied now, towering and slender, like a thorn-piercing heaven. The door was open. Light bled from within, but not a holy light. It flickered like fire underwater. It pulsed like a heartbeat. He crossed the threshold. Inside, the pews were gone. The altar was ash. In their place stood a single obsidian basin, waist-high, filled with a viscous black fluid that pulsed faintly in time with the tolling bell. And behind it, suspended in the air, was the missing chapter, not inked on parchment now, but floating, immense, made of smoke and voice and memory. It whispered his name again. He approached the basin. The Bible opened in his arms, now weightless, humming in that same impossible note as the bell above. The final line emerged. Sacrifice is not blood, it is remembrance. Cotter didn't pray. He simply leaned forward and breathed into the basin. His breath came out black. The surface shifted. The bell stopped. And with it, every voice outside went silent. For a moment, the whole world held its breath. Then the basin cracked. A sound like ice over deep water. And the chapel groaned as if in mourning. Outside, Dunn stood alone in the falling snow. The woman was gone. The figures were gone. Only he remained, holding a bell that no longer hummed. He looked toward the chapel. Smoke rose. The steeple had crumbled. The door hung off its hinges. And the Bible, the original, lay at his feet, its cover cold once more. He picked it up. The final page was blank. And it always would be.